B'shtar, four lines down.
Okay.
So one of the ways to acquire an eved is with a shtar. How do we know? Okay, this is with regard to Oma Ha'ivriya. This is a girl who's sold as a slave, and the master does yi'ud, which means that he marries her, or his son does yi'ud. The Torah says, obviously, as you might suspect, this woman was a former maidservant. He might treat her less than any of his other wives, which he may have. So, if he takes another wife, then she'erik susa v'ainasai. So from here we learn that in general the obligation of a man is she'erik susa and aina. What exactly those are? It's machlokes the Gemara, but briefly, she'era is typically understood to mean food. Susa is clothing, and ainasai is intimacy. So he has to treat both wives equally. Now, imachera sikachle means that we're sort of comparing the married Oma Ha'ivriya to another wife. Just like a woman could be acquired with a shtar, Oma Ha'ivriya could also be acquired with a shtar, since we're equating Oma Ha'ivriya with a regular wife. So now the question is, okay, so if you want to say that Oma Ha'ivriya could be acquired with a shtar, obviously it would depend on who writes the shtar. If you're equating Oma Ha'ivriya to a regular married woman, then it would make sense that the master is the one that writes the shtar. So that would make sense. The master writes it. So then it's a comparison between that type of document and a marital document. But according to the opinion that says the father writes it, there's no real comparison because it's a completely different type of document. To Itmar we learned, who writes the document? Rav Huna says Odni Kaisva, the master writes it. Rav Chizda Amar Av Kaisva, the father writes. So according to Rav Huna, this makes sense because the master should be writing the document if it's similar to Kiddushin. Rav Chizda Michael Meimar, according to Rav Chizda, how exact? First of all, how do we know that shtar works? And second of all, it seems to be a completely different type of document. So Amar Racha Bar Yaakov Amar Kollel Seitzik it says Salvadim. 1 second. Okay, so according to Rav Chizda, the document of Oma Ha'ivriya is completely different than the document of Kiddushin. Why? Because it depends on who's writing it. Typically, you'd think that the one who's acquiring should be writing the document. But by Oma Ha'ivriya, it's actually the opposite. The father who sells her is writing the document. So you can't really, it wouldn't be a direct comparison to Kiddushin. You can't really equate it to Kiddushin because it's a different type of document. So how does Rav Chizda know that an Oma Ha'ivriya could be acquired with a shtar, with a document? So Amar Racha Bar Yaakov Amar Kollel Seitzik it says Ha'avodim. By Oma Ha'ivriya it says she does not leave like a regular slave. And we understand it to mean Aval Niknas Hu Kinyan Avodim. When in terms of her leaving the slavery, she doesn't leave like a regular slave. Aval Niknas Hu Kinyan Avodim. But she is acquired through the kinyan that pertains to a regular slave. Okay, what does this mean? When we have an Eved Kanani is a non-Jewish slave, which doesn't mean he's non-Jewish. I mean he's quasi-Jewish. He's a slave Jewish, the status of a slave. An Eved Kanani, how does he leave? There's two ways for him to be free. Number one is if the master frees him, and number two is if the master takes a limb off. Gemara will give specifics. I'm not sure if it's in Kiddushin. The Gemara goes through there are 24 limbs that if they're broken or ruined, or removed, the slave goes out free. This is true specifically by an Eved Kanani. An Oma Ha'ivriya and Eved Ivri for that matter do not leave B'Rosh Eivarim. So Torah says, Lo Yiseitzik it says Ha'avadim. Don't leave like an Eved Kanani leaves. How does an Eved Kanani leave? What we call Shein V'ayin. tooth or an eye, or sometimes it's called Rashi Evarim, the extremities of the organs. So a regular slave leaves when he loses an organ. Obviously, presumably it's by accident, and it would be true intentionally as well. They're both true. But it's not true with regard to an Amar Ivriya or an Eved Ivri. Okay, but that's with regard to leaving. But she could be acquired like an Eved Kanani is acquired. How is an Eved Kanani acquired? One of the methods is with a document. How do we know this works? Because a document can be used to acquire property. That's pretty clear in Yirmiyah. So God told Yirmiyah to write, to buy property and write documents. Now the Gemara says maybe the document was only a proof; it wasn't actually the vehicle of acquisition. Be that as it may, and an Eved, in general, slaves are treated with the equivalent set of laws as property. So therefore, if the property can be acquired with a shtar, an Eved Kanani could be acquired with a shtar, and an Amar Ivriya doesn't leave like an Eved Kanani, but could be acquired like an Eved Kanani, which means that shtar would work. Everybody lost you. Eric?
You too can be a shtar. I'm actually amazing that I'm really kind of shocked about that. Leave on follow.
Okay.
The thought, I'm following the thought. I could use a page addition check.
Okay. Page addition check, about 15, 16 lines down. First one line is for Ema. Okay. This portion gets a little complicated. Okay. Now, there's another method to acquire an Eved Kanani, and this is the much more traditional method. How is the first Eved Kanani ever acquired? Wartime, by force. It's called chazaka. You're in war and you take him, capture him. So maybe actually the Kenyan. So we're saying like this: an Amar Ivriya, she doesn't leave like a slave, right? A slave leaves with Rashi Evarim, Shein v'ayin, a tooth or an eye, and an Amar Ivriya does not have that type of method of leaving, but she's acquired the same manner. How do you acquire Eved Kanani? There's two methods really. One of them is a document, but what's the other one? You capture him, chazaka. Maybe that is the method that is used to take an Amar Ivriya, and it's clearly not because it's not in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says the method is shtar, a document, not chazaka. Hold on, but if you're telling me that we're comparing Amar Ivriya to Eved in the method of acquisition of Eved Kanani, so why don't we say maybe actually have to capture an Amar Ivriya? Maybe we're talking here about chazaka. So Gemara says Amar Kra v'snachaltem oisam levnechem acharechem. With regard to Eved Kanani, v'snachaltem, they will be an inheritance levnechem acharechem, for your children after them. So you can inherit an Eved Kanani. Like we noted before, you cannot inherit an Eved Ivri. An Eved Ivri, the children actually are allowed to use the Eved Ivri for the first 6 years. If he's a nirtza, then he leaves. It's only an Eved Ivri, not an Amar Ivriya, and it's only the children. It's not any other inheritors. There are no children, the Eved Ivri goes free.
So it did explain to all children, not just sons.
Sons.
Okay.
Sons. Yeah. Okay. You'll inherit Eved Kanani. Now, obviously, there's nothing clear about. There's nothing here referencing in the verse about chazaka, right? We didn't mention anything about chazaka. So the Gemara is going to choose chazaka anyway. We'll see. The Gemara is going to ask, like maybe it's shtar. Okay. There's something unique with regard to Eved Kanani that you can inherit them. And what's that uniqueness? Because the Eved Kanani can be acquired with chazaka, but no other type of Eved could be acquired with chazaka. Now, the verse is not at all clear. It is not clear from the verse that we're referring to chazaka. So the Gemara asks the obvious question. Well, maybe it's the opposite, right? Maybe it means that Eved Kanani has shtar and nobody else has shtar. In other words, only an Eved Kanani can be acquired with shtar, but an Eved But an evet ivri amma ivriya cannot be acquired with shtar. So in other words, you're telling me that we know one method works, we know one method doesn't work, and the Gemara until now is deciding the method that works is shtar, the method that doesn't work is chazaka. The Gemara says, well, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe actually shtar is what doesn't work, and chazaka is what does work. Together. So Gemara says, hold on, but we know how could say savodim. In other words, so let's say it could say savodim means that one of the two methods is included, one of them is not included. Okay, so one of the methods is included, one of them is not included. The Gemara says, Umaros, why are you choosing shtar and excluding chazaka? Maybe it's the opposite. Mistav shtar havle l'rabuye. It makes sense that in other words, Evet Kanani has two methods: chazaka, capturing, and shtar, the document. Chazaka is not just capturing; chazaka is also just taking him physically. Same idea, though. So we have shtar and chazaka. Which one are we going to include? Which one are we going to exclude? We know one is included. We know one is excluded. So now we're going to use svar, a reason. Why would I think we should include shtar and exclude chazaka? Very simple, because we know that shtar is a valid kinyan by a ben or bas chayrin. In other words, if a man is divorcing his wife, because we know the concept of shtar works by a Jewish woman for divorce. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. Well, we know that chazaka also works by regular Jews. Let's say you have a convert who has no inheritors, and he dies, then anyone can take his property. How do you acquire it? The chazaka, by taking it. Okay, so therefore, we see chazaka also works by regular Jews. So Gemara says, "B'ishus miyas le'eshchem." You don't find it with regard to ishus, with regard to marriage. I.e., Alma Ivriya is a form that there is a component of marriage there. And if we had to say, we have to choose a method to acquire Alma Ivriya, we're going to prefer the one that we know works in some context of marriage. That is shtar, a document. Obviously, shtar works for divorce, it also works for Kiddushin. Chazaka does not. Okay. Another possibility. Another possibility is that it's a combination drasha. Again, so we know that Visnachalta Maisim excludes one method. Includes one method. You could acquire Oma Ivriya like an Evet Kanani. That includes a method. We're together on that? Which one should we prefer? Which one should we exclude? So the first resolution of the Gemara was logically. Which one's more logical? It's logical to include shtar. Why? Because shtar, we know it pertains to marriage. Fine. The second resolution is, well, okay, we don't know, fine. So we have to include and we have to exclude. We don't know which one to include. For that, we'll say, look, let's say the master does yud and marries the Alma Ivriya, and then wants to take another wife. They have to be treated equally. Both wives have to be treated equally. We see from here that there's sort of a comparison between a regular woman and an Alma Ivriya. Now, even though that comparison can't tell me that the method of acquisition is a document, because fundamentally it's a different type of document. We're going to Rav Chisda here. In Rav Chisda's world, the document of a regular woman is written by the husband, whereas the document of an Alma Ivriya is written by the father. It's the opposite type of document. However, fine. So we can't learn it from Imacharis Sikachlai. However, Imacharis is sufficient to tell me that when we know there are two methods, one is going to be included, one is going to be excluded. Which one should be included? Which one should be excluded? Imacharis Sikachlai tells me use the method that's similar to a regular woman, which is a document shtar. Okay, for Rav Huna, okay. For Rav Huna highlights says I could say we'll start a new Gemara in a second. Tezayin, I'm an Aleph, a little around halfway down the page. First one line is Huna. For Rav Huna, what is he? So according to Rav Huna, we know that shtar works because it says there's an equivocation, there's an equivalence between a married woman and an Amma Ha'ivriya, which tells me that shtar works for Amma Ha'ivriya, because according to Rav Huna, shtar it's the same type of document. The master is writing it, the husband's writing it. So what does Rav Huna learn from, let's say it's that the Amma Ha'ivriya is acquired the same way as an Evet Kanani? So Rav Huna basically reads it simply. Let's say it's means she doesn't leave like a slave. She doesn't leave with Rosh Evarim, which is exactly what the pasuk was intended to tell me. Rav Chisda might say in other words, Rav Huna says that this pasuk is not extra. I would think that in Amma Ha'ivriya, if by mistake you flicked off, her nose or the edge of her ear or her finger, then or tooth, that's the easiest one, safest too. If you took off her tooth, then she would go out free. That's the Torah says. So I can't tell me that it's coming to include something else, because I needed to tell me the core idea that an Amma Ha'ivriya does not leave b'shein v'ayin with a tooth or an eye. However, if Chisda notes that it's an interesting terminology. The word seis, the method of leaving of a slave, is unique. Why do I have to say tseis? She shouldn't leave like a slave. The fact that it says kitseis ha'avadim, that tells me two things. Number one, that she doesn't leave b'shein v'ayin. If you did not get a tooth, she's still a slave. And number two, that one of the methods of acquisition of a slave is in common with Amma Ha'ivriya. Okay. A slave acquires himself with years, 6 years. He works for 6 years. At the end of the 6 years, b'shvius, in the 7th year, he leaves. The yovel, how do we know that he leaves on yovel? He works with you until yovel. The giroin kesef. Giroin kesef means he's able to redeem himself. Amar Chizkiah to Amar Kro, the pasuk says v'hifta. 1 second. Yeah. The hefta is the father redeeming his daughter Amma Ha'ivriya. We know that he can redeem, that obviously he's able to redeem her. Tana, we learned when a slave acquires himself, the kesef ubeshava kesef, with money or equivalent value, ubeshtar, with a document. Okay, bishlam kesef, I understand money. Dirsiv mi kesef miknosai. 1 second. This is Yashiv. There it is. Im oid rabbis pashonim. If there are still many years, let's say he's only worked for a year, lefia, and according to that amount, Yashiv ulasem mi kesef miknosai. The opportunity to redeem him will return according to the value that was spent. It's a fancy way of saying that if you sold him for 6 years for $600, it's $100 per year, right? About 30 something cents per day, a little less than 30 cents a day. Okay. Shava kesef, equivalent value. So in other words, instead of giving him dollars, you gave him, I don't know, silver, maybe you gave him vegetables or something else that has clear market value. Yoshev Gulase means that the redemption returns, the value of the slave returns to the master. That means sort of in any way that it returns, even if it's not money. It's give him chairs and tables instead of money. Okay, and that teaches me that Shava Kesef, the value which is given by cash value of physical items, is sufficient, like Kesef, like money itself. What's the story with shtar? If the document here is a document that's written on his value, meaning that's effectively Hainu Kesef. In other words, the document here is a redemption document. He's paying for himself. Well, that is Kesef. That's a way of redeeming him. Elo Shichur. It's an emancipation. So the Gemara says, Shtar Alamali, why do you need to write a document? Leimale ba'apetray, go get 2 witnesses and tell them, Zil, I forgive your slavery, and you're now a free man. Inami ba'ape bedinazil, or in front of the court, tell him to leave. Now, forgive his indebtedness to you. and he can go out. He can go out free. Rava says, the ownership of an Eved Ivri is not just a financial obligation. There is a kinyan isser going on as well, meaning there are certain halachic law statuses that change, and those can't be forgiven. You can't forgive the process because the process isn't up to you. In other words, if I hire a laborer for 10 years, I put a 10-year contract, he's going to work with me for 10 years, and I'll pay him every single year. Then at some point, I say, you know what? I forgive 8 years worth of work. Contract is still valid. So I owe him 8 years worth of salary, and he doesn't have to work for me. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with any type of financial arrangement. You can work it out however you want. Any side can forgive whatever they want. As long as it doesn't pertain to anybody else, they can forgive any of the obligations themselves. However, Eved Ivri is not merely a financial obligation. Because it's not a financial obligation, you have no right to forgive it. You're not the boss here. The Torah gives a specific set of rules. You have to follow those rules. One of them is redemption. You can allow the slave to redeem himself. You can't just forgive it because it's not up to you. Because gufay kone, the slave itself, you own him in much more than just a financial obligation. There are laws of Isser. For example, a slave is allowed to marry a shifta kananis and beget children with her. That's because it's an Isser component. There's halachic law that changes because of a slave status. You can't just forgive that and it will go away. Okay, next, Yisera Olav Oma Ha'ivriya. This Gemara is also a little complicated. Oma Ha'ivriya has an additional method of leaving, and that is Simonim, if she has puberty. Amr Shlakish, so Shlakish says, very interesting point here. Oma Ha'ivriya kainetz atzma v'misa sa'av merusha sa'adin. Okay, an Oma Ha'ivriya, if she's sold as a slave and her father dies, she leaves the slavery. Not the master, the father, her own father. Mikal b'chaymer, it's kal b'chaymer. Now recall, we saw this in Kiddushin quite a few times, so at least one major time, and we'll see it again many more times. A father is able to marry off his daughter until she is 12 and a half years old. Once 6 months following the beginning of maturity, he loses all privileges. Until that point, he's allowed to marry her off. Until the point where she is mature, he can sell her as a slave. And also, her if she finds a lost object, he gets to keep it, etc. Okay. Initial puberty does not remove her from the father's domain. She moves from what's called a katana, an immature child, to a naira, a girl who's in the middle of maturity. So Simonim does not remove her from the father's domain. Yet it is able to remove her from the master's domain. She leaves when she has signs of maturity. Misa, in other words, Misa Sa'av, if the father dies, that the children cannot, the person does not inherit his daughters to his sons. It's a privilege of the father only. So if the father dies, then nobody has control over her anymore. And in addition, certainly it should be able to remove her from the domain of the master. And this is the opinion of Rish Lakish. The Gemara here now goes to try to prove it wrong, and the Gemara is sort of successful. Meisvei, question. Meisvei asked, go to our Mishnah. Is Misa Sa'av listed in our Mishnah? No. Right, Eved Ivri, he goes free with 6 years, Yovel, or redemption. Al-Mevriya also gets Simonim. If she shows signs of maturity, puberty, then she leaves. But if the father dying is also a method of her leaving the slavery, Nisni Nami Misav, why is the Mishnah not listed? So the Gemara says Tana V'Shayar. The Mishnah, the Tana left over, he put some things in the Mishnah, but he left over others. Okay, so anytime the Tana forgets to put something in the Mishnah, there have to be 2 items. right? The Gemara will always ask, my shire, what else was left out? The high shire, to justify him leaving out this as well. So the Gemara says, shire misas adin. He left out the death of the master. If the master dies, in Omah Ivriya does not go to the master's children. So the Gemara says, that's not something that was left out. To keep on the economic the ish like Tani. Death of the master is a method that will also free an Eved Ivri. An Eved Ivri will also leave if the master dies. If it's within the 6 years, then specifically the sons will inherit him. But nobody else will inherit him. So it's very likely that the slave will go out free. Okay. The Elanistni. So if that's the case, why is Misas Ha'av not listed? So the Gemara says, Tana Dover Sheyesh Lekitzva. Tana Dover Sheyesh Tani Dover Sheyesh Lekitzva like Tani. Things that are set and are relatively fixed, those are the things that Tana wrote down. Dover Sheyesh Lekitzva like Tani. Things that are not fixed, like death of the father, it's not listed in the Mishnah. Okay. What's an example of a fixed thing? 6 years, right? Yovel's fixed. Or Geroin Kesef, money. How much money? I'll divide by 6 and multiply by the number of days. Okay, Zamara says 1 second. Hasimonim, puberty, the Ein Lahem Kitzva, there's no set time. Uktani, and the Mishnah wrote it. Rav Safar, so Safar says, Ein Lahem Kitzva Lamala, Avyesh Lahem Kitzva Lamata. There's no upper limit. In other words, it could be that some girls will have pubic signs of puberty beginning 12 years old, and it can continue going for a few years. And in the case of an island, it's even longer. Tanya we learn, but however, there is a minimum age. If you have a 9-year-old that has pubic hair, that does not indicate that he's mature. It's shuma. It's what does Rashi say? I don't know how to translate that one. An outlier and anomaly. An outlier. Rashi seems to say it might be a wart or something like that. Let's say there was pubic growth between 9 years old and 12 years old, and the pubic growth is still there. So the first opinion says shuma. That is not an indication of maturity. Rabbi Yehudah Aimer Simon. It is a sign of maturity. Okay. Ben Yud Gimel Shana V'Yamechad, 13 years and older. Divrei Kol Simon. Everyone agrees that it is a sign of maturity. Why the Bryce here is talking about males as opposed to females? Because by females it's 12, not 13. Separate discussion in the Gemara, and need to discuss it. Okay. So basically the mission. Because signs of maturity do have a minimum age, therefore, that is why the Mishnah includes it, and that's why the Mishnah does not include death of the father, because who knows if and when that's going to happen. Most of Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes is the following question: Rav Shimon Aimer, Dalad Manikin Lahem. There are 4 people that get ha'anaka. Ha'anaka is the gifts that are given to a slave when he leaves. Gimel b'ish, 3 by a man. The Gimel b'isha, 3 by a woman. You can't say that there are 4 by a man or 4 by a woman, because simonim don't apply to a man and ritzia doesn't apply to a woman. Okay, so there are 4 ways of leaving that will give you ha'anaka. Of those 4, 1 pertains to a man but not a woman. That's ritzia, drilling his ear when he leaves in Yafel, because we do not drill the ear of a woman. And secondly, it is simonim, physical maturity, because a girl can be sold as a slave in Omah Ivriya, but a katan, a male child, cannot. Therefore, simonim will never be a way that he'll leave his slavery. Okay, 1 second. And what are the other 2 methods? Presumably, one of them is redemption, and one of them is years, or yovel. One of them is yovel, one of them is years. 6 years. The Misa, but if leaving because the father dies is a method of leaving an Omah Ivriya, Nistina Misav should be listed also. And if you'll tell me that the Bryce left out something, it says 4. And if you'll tell me the 4 include things that are set amounts V'dover she'ein like it's so things that are not set, like death of the husband, which may or may not happen, like Tani isn't included. V'hasimanim the ein lem kitzav v'ktani. Simanim, signs of maturity, there's no limit because it could happen anywhere from 13 years, 12, 13 years and older, or even, or significantly older than that. And it is listed. The chitem, and if you tell me the previous resolution of the Gemara, Hachan Amikid Rav Safra, we'll go with Rav Safra, which means that Simanim does have a limit. It's a minimum limit. It has to be at least 12 or 13 years old. The same that Teretz Gemara gave previously. Death of the master is listed in the Bryce also. Presumably that's one of the four methods, right? It would be, I guess, years, shanim, misa sa'adin, and then simanim or ritzia. Simanim or yovel. So the Gemara says, no, misa sa'adin ami like tani. Death of the master is not listed. So what are the four methods if death of the master isn't one of them? Because until now we thought the four methods are 6 years, death of the master, yovel as it pertains to ritzia, someone whose ear was drilled, which is only relevant to a man, and simanim, which is only relevant to a woman. Now that we're saying that misa sa'adin's out, then what are the four things? So the Gemara says shanim, years, the yovel and yovel, the yovel shel ritzia, and the fact that someone with a drilled ear leaves on yovel as well. So we count yovel twice, basically. The Amavriya and an Amavriya b'simanim with signs of maturity. It also makes sense that actually we should count yovel twice. If you can't say that there are four by a man or four by a woman, because there's no yovel by a woman and there's no maturity by a man. For a second, there is yovel by a woman. Of course, there's yovel by a woman. Woman leaves in yovel. Almavri leaves in yovel. What does it mean? It means there's no yovel of ritzia, meaning there's no yovel that someone whose ear was drilled leaves. Obviously, that indicates to me that we're counting yovel twice. One yovel, the regular yovel, is common between a man and a woman. The fact that a nirtza leaves on yovel, we're counting separately, and that only relates to a man and not to a woman. The Gemara says, it's clear that yovel is being counted twice. Most of Rav Amram had the following question, very similar to the previous question in the Gemara. These people get hanaka, they get the gifts. This price is very clear. Years, yovel, 6 years, yovel, death of the master, signs of maturity. The imisa, if you're telling me that death of the father is a method of leaving, nisni nami misa'av, so misa'av should be listed as well. The chitem, and if you tell me ton of ashayar are things that are missing, va'el tani, the Mishnah says these are the ways, these specifically. The chitem, and if you'll say you'll tell me things that have limits that are listed. And if you tell me at least there's a minimum limit. There's death of the master, which may or may not happen. It's not fixed. It's not a yesh lekitzvah. So why isn't death of the father listed in this brisa? To Yufta der Shlakish, this is a very strong question on Rish Lakish, and to Yufta it remains unresolved. So now the Gemara says, okay, hold on a second. Rish Lakish had a very good argument. He said it's a kal v'chomer. If death of the father removes a girl from the father's domain, and it's harder to remove the girl from the father's domain than the master's domain, for sure the death of the father should remove the girl from the master's domain. So the Gemara says, the Gemara says kal v'chomer pricha. Kal v'chomer is incorrect. Why? How do we know the father? It's harder to leave the father's domain than the master's domain because simanim work for the master but don't work for the father. Mala simanim shenishtana haguf. Simanim are a different category of leaving because the body is physically changes. Therefore, it's its own category of ways of leaving, and it's unfair to include a kal v'chomer to compare death of the father to simanim. To physical maturity. Okay. Let's begin the next Gemara. Tani Chada, one brisa says, "Onok evet ivri la'atzmai." the gifts of the Eved Ivri, he gets to keep, which the Gemara will point out seems to be pretty obvious. Like, who else would get it? The gifts of an Am Ivriya, she gets to keep. The Tanya Idach, another bright says, Onik Am Ivriya, the gifts of the gifts when she finishes her slavery go to her father. Not only that, if she finds a lost object while she's a slave, it also goes to her father. And the master gets a reimbursement for the amount of time it took to find the lost object, because ultimately that time came off the master. Okay, so we have a contradiction. Do the gifts go to the father? For the gifts of the Am Ivriya, do they go to the father or do they go to her? My love must be if she leaves with signs of physical maturity, so she has a father, so then it goes to the father. But if her father dies, so there is no father, then she gets to keep it, which would support the opinion of Rish Lakish. So the Gemara says, light, not necessarily. Both scenarios is where she left because of maturity. And it's not difficult. If the father's around, then you get to then the Hanaka goes to the father. If the father's not around, then she gets to keep it. Okay. We'll stop here. Where did I?